Please proceed. Thank you.
Tēnā rā tātou e ngā minito o te wā, o whira kia koutou katoa. Look, I'll keep this pretty short and sharp, eh? So, and if it's all right with you, I will be reading off all my points that I have noted down. Nō reira, me tino
Yes.
tika konei.
Thank you.
This bill is inconsistent as other local government changes, like establishing rural wards for people in remote areas to have guaranteed representation, or just establishing a new general ward, which do not require referendums. Now, the requirement to have a referendum is in breach of Te Tiriti or Waitangi. We know this, and this proposal is purely to advance ideologies and agenda instead of respecting what is best for local communities. It is likely to be costly, not just for councils, but for us as taxpayers, and creates a greater race division across our hapori, huri noi te motu. So Māori collectively, as land trusts and iwi, have often had kaitiaki responsibilities for wāhi tapu and significant holdings of land across the TLAs. It's important that our views as tangata whenua are included in local and national government. In addition, this bill is in breach of the government's commitment to the United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. In particular, Indigenous peoples have suffered from historic injustices as a result of, inter alia, their colonisation and disposition of their lands, territories and resources, thus preventing them from exercising in particular their right to development in accordance with their own needs and interests. And this bill continues to create injustice. Article 5 states Indigenous peoples have the right to maintain and strengthen their distinct political, legal, economical, social, cultural institutions while retaining their right to participation fully, if they so choose, in the political, economic, social and cultural life of the state. This proposed bill clearly diminishes our right to participate in the effective measures and consultation and cooperation with the Indigenous peoples concerned. To combat prejudice and eliminate discrimination and to promote tolerance, understanding and good relations among Indigenous peoples and all other whānau and segments of society. Article 18, which is Indigenous peoples have the right to participation in decision-making in matters which would affect their rights through representation, chosen by themselves in accordance with their own procedures, as well as to maintain and develop their own Indigenous decision-making institutions. Again, Article 19 states that states should consult and cooperate in good faith with Indigenous peoples concerned through their own representative institutions in order to obtain their free, prior and informed consent before adopting and implementing legislative or administrative measures that may affect them, as we've seen in the short time frame that we've had to be able to provide submissions for this particular kaupapa. But this has not happened. And this bill also undermines Article 23, where Indigenous peoples have the right to determine and develop priorities and strategies for exercising their own right to development. This bill purposefully seeks to exclude our voice from local government and regional strategies. And Article 28, Aroha 25, Indigenous peoples have the right to maintain and strengthen their distinctive spiritual relationships with their traditionally owned and otherwise occupied and used lands, territories, waters, and coastal seas and other resources, and to uphold their responsibilities to future generations in this regard. And I could go on, but I know we're short for time, so I might just head to my concluding point. Indigenous peoples have the right to own, use, develop, and control the lands, territories, and resources that they possess by reason of traditional ownership or other traditional occupation or use, as well as those which they have otherwise acquired. States shall give legal recognition and protection of these lands, territories, and resources. Such recognition shall be conducted with due respect to the customs, traditions, and land tenure systems of the Indigenous peoples concerned. In proposing this bill, the government seeks to undermine and damage local, regional, and national relationships and protections that have been developed over generations. This bill offers no legal recognition or protection of the rights of Indigenous people. And I'll hand it over to Anjum.
Thank you.
Thank you, Aotearoa. And so Aotearoa has provided a tangata whenua perspective. From our organisation, I'll be providing a tangata tiriti perspective. So my key points start with going back to the fact that the time for submissions has been incredibly short, and therefore I would contend that this is hampering the democratic process. The regulatory impact statement states, and I quote, "Due to timeframes and confidentiality requirements, Treaty of Waitangi partners have not been consulted during the policy development process." So my comment is that the people most harmed by this bill have not been adequately consulted. They also say, and I quote, due to tight timeframes, there was no public consultation or consultation with iwi and Māori on reinstating polls on the establishment of Māori wards and Māori consistencies. Also, the impact statement says the Treaty of Waitangi impact analysis was not as detailed or as thorough as would be expected for a bill of this nature. And my comment on that is that this shows that the background work hasn't yet been done. And I quote again, due to the time constraints of the bill, consultation with the local government sector has been very limited. Again, showing that there hasn't been adequate consultation of those most directly impacted by this bill. My next point, local bodies have the right to make these decisions. Local bodies are representative government. They are a form of representative government. That means that voters are choosing representatives who will consider all informations and make decisions on their behalf. The decisions made by those councils should stand. It is unjust for central government to impose what local government has decided is best for their local communities in terms of representation. Local government are closer to local communities, engage with them and understand them better. This bill reduces democratic rights, imposing the will of central government, and to bind them for 2 terms is unjust and unduly restrictive. And certainly from a libertarian perspective of small government, this is an authoritative measure that goes against those kinds of beliefs. Moreover, if a poll is to be conducted for every issue, then there would be no ability to effectively make decisions, and it would undermine representative democracy. There is no compelling reason that has been put forward why this issue should go to a poll above all other issues. There was no referendum, for example, on Māori seats in central government, nor is one needed. And this, the case has just not been made. My next point is that disinformation is an attack on fair decision-making. For example, the notion that Māori are getting an extra vote. There is not an extra vote. When they vote on a Māori ward from the Māori role, they don't get to vote on a general ward. But what we've seen from Australia, and I'm quoting from a BBC World News article, that there has been a huge rise in disinformation when they had the Voice referendum over there. Also, there has been a huge rise in harm from a referendum of this kind. And I quote from the article that mental health agencies are saying, we've had a 106% rise in the last 4 months on abuse calls, which I put down to the Voice basically, says Marjorie Anderson, the national manager at 13 Yarn, a crisis support line for First Nations Australians. And adding to that, there'd been a rise in attack and discriminations as a result of that poll and further evidence from the Lancet. The Voice referendum, I'm quoting again, the Voice referendum process creates a substantial cultural load for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Indigenous peoples are being asked and expected to engage in conversations around this topic and often are then challenged to defend their position. To address these stressors, the Australian government has allocated 10 million to the National Aboriginal Community Controlled Health Organisation to support the mental health of First Nations people during the campaign. We're not aware of any such allocation in this bill to support the harm that is going to arise from these polls every time a poll is being undertaken. From the Sydney Morning Herald, a spokesperson for eSafety Commissioner, again I'm quoting, Julie Inman-Grant said there had been a more than 10% increase in proportion of complaints and that this will likely intensify as we approach the referendum date, especially targeting First Nations people. I quote from ABC Australia, the Assembly's head of communications, Kokatha woman Amy Rust, said that in recent weeks, the number of people her team had blocked for racist abuse had risen from about 1 or 2 a day to 50. I'm feeling worn down. I'm feeling exhausted. This should have to be my day job. This shouldn't have to be my day job that I have to sift through racist material. And note that we don't have the protection of legislation such as the Online Safety Act or the Digital Safety Act and so on, legislation that is in place in UK, Ireland, the European Union, Australia, and soon to be enacted in Canada. The Safer Online Services and Media Platforms consultation has been shelved, and there is therefore no effective legal measure to protect the democratic process from the abuse of online spaces, nor is there effective protection against the harassment faced by those who want to protect Te Tiriti rights. Fair representation is not happening at present, and without Māori wards, there was definitely a lack of effective representation of tangata whenua. I go back to DIA's own regulatory impact statement, which states the United Nations Human Rights Committee has previously raised concerns about the representation of Māori in local government and asked New Zealand to take steps to address this. The Māori wards provision in this bill could be considered a regression in this area. Also in the statement, in New Zealand's 2021 report to the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, the report provided the amendments to Māori ward provisions as an example of New Zealand progressing Article 5 of this convention. The bill could be considered regression. The Ministry of Justice's compliance report. We note that in practice, binding polls have proven a barrier to the establishment of Māori wards in local authorities. Further, the bill does not enable local authorities to retain their existing or proposed Māori wards or constituencies unless and until electors demand a poll or the local authority resolves to hold one. For these reasons, the bill appears likely to result in a reduction in the representation of Māori as a specific community of interest, including by subjecting Māori as a specific community of interest to particular procedural requirements. We consider this as disadvantageous for electors on the Māori roll in a local authority context relative to their current positions. So you are going against the advice of your own officials here. I'd like to finally just address the notion that this is discriminatory. I'm now quoting from the Human Rights Commission's website that both the Human Rights Act and the Bill of Rights Act provide for special measures. Both require any measures to be taken in good faith and permit actions that would otherwise be lawful. The person or groups must also need or be reasonably supposed to need assistance in order to achieve an equal place in the community. As a consequence of Aotearoa Fishing Code Limited versus Nelson Polytechnic No. 2, at present, the only case on special measures, it is necessary to establish that the target group does not occupy an equal place in a community and the measure is necessary for them to achieve equality with others. However, if a law, policy, or practice does not meet that criteria, it may still be justified under Section 5 of the Bill of Rights Act. For example, if a policy advantages a particular group against whom it is unlawful to discriminate, and its purpose is not to assist persons who are disadvantaged by discrimination, it may still be lawful if it is done in good faith and there is a rational connection between the purposes of the scheme and what it seeks to achieve. Now, the requirement to have Māori wards is an equity measure and is to ensure fair representation. And there has been research from the University of Victoria, amongst other places, showing that prior to the Māori wards bill in 2021, there had been a clear gap in representation and a clear equity and equality gap. As a naturalised New Zealander who came here in 1972 and who resides in the Waikato, I'm stating to you that I support Indigenous rights. I support UNDRIP, which a government willingly signed, chose to sign, and should uphold. I contend that in upholding Indigenous rights, you uphold my rights as tangata tiriti, and in fact, everybody's rights. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question as well. Huhana Linden, please. You're on mute.
Hello. I'm just trying to transfer over to my phone as I travel. But I wanted to get an understanding from you in terms of the Indigenous versus the migrant or ethnic whānau. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yes, absolutely happy to do that. We actually run comprehensive Te Tiriti training for ethnic and migrant communities around Te Tiriti, so have a lot of experience in this area. So we contend that as part of ethnic communities who may or may not be migrant, as being part of this motu, that we have certain rights and responsibilities. Part of our responsibilities are to understand the history of this country, to understand past injustices and current injustices, and to understand the impact of those injustices, that we as ethnic minority communities shouldn't only be advocating for our own rights, but that as part of the society, we need to be advocating for rights of other parts of the community who have been harmfully impacted over centuries, and that once the government and society respects and upholds Indigenous rights, it shows that they are able to understand multiple points of view, multiple worldviews, the different ways of being able to do things, and that can only enhance us when we ask for our views to also be considered, and when we put forward that the way that policies, legislation, regulation are working at the moment are not providing us just access to our needs that other communities are getting, that we are not in an equitable position. So therefore, I cannot see a place where we wouldn't stand alongside and uphold Indigenous rights, UNDRIP, tangata whenua, that we wouldn't push for structural change that provides for equity, that we wouldn't push for a worldview that we find we have many values in common with. We would absolutely do that. And when we speak to ethnic communities and talk to them about their place in Te Tiriti, that quickly becomes apparent to them. And we ask them to think about where they want to place themselves in the Te Tiriti relationship and what they want to uphold in terms of what are discriminatory practices already happening both within the public sector and within community. I hope that
need to cut you there, but thank you very, very much for your submission. I think we did give you about 15 minutes there, but thank you for that. It was excellent in answering the questions. Members, we've got one last.